Hello, this is Sudarshana Starshine Star. Welcome to my channel. In this clip, I'm going to be continuing the series, What Every American Needs to Know Now, and this will be part 9. And believe me, this is a scorcher. Whew. So I'm going to be reading from the book entitled Meet Your Straw Man and Whatever You Want to Know. And I'll show you the book cover at the end of this clip. Let's begin with the 3 opening prayers. I always like to begin all of my clips with those. It helps to protect and heal and kind of seal in the highest and the best energy for anyone and everyone watching this clip and sharing it. So thank you so much. Let's go. Om, 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 Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwaraha, Guru Sakshat Parabrahmam Tasmahi Sri Guruvena Namaha. Om Suklam Parataram Vishnum Sishivarnam Chatubhujam Prasanavaranam Dhyaye Sarva Vidno Prashantaye. Om Bhur Bhuva Suvaha Tatsavitur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yo Naha Prachodayat. Om Shanti Shanti, Shanti. I'm going to read again the last paragraph that I read at the end of part 8 of this series, because I feel that's a good idea to do. Later, in 1913, apparently unwilling to risk another questionable amendment, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act over the Christmas holiday, while members of Congress who were opposed to the measure were at home. This was a very underhanded deal, as the Constitution, which explicitly grants Congress the authority to issue the public currency, does not authorize it to delegate that authority to another party. And so it should have required a new amendment to allow Congress to transfer that authority to a private bank. But Congress passed it, and President Woodrow Wilson signed it, as he had promised the bankers that he would in exchange for generous campaign contributions. Wilson later regretted that decision, stating in 1919, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." The very next year, World War I started, and it is important to remember that prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve, there was no such thing as a world war, no profits, no wars. The First World War started between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, but quickly shifted to focus to Germany, whose industrial capacity was seen as an economic threat to Great Britain, who saw the decline of the British pound as a result of too much emphasis on financial activity to the neglect of agriculture, industrial development, and infrastructure, not unlike the present-day United States. Although pre-war Germany had a private central bank, that bank was heavily restricted and inflation kept to reasonable levels. Under government control, investment was guaranteed to internal economic development, and Germany was seen as a major power. So in the media of the day, Germany was portrayed as the prime instigator of World War I, and subsequently not just defeated, but had its industrial base flattened. Following the Treaty of Versailles, June 1919, Germany was ordered to pay the war costs of all of the participating nations, even though Germany had not actually started the war. This amounted to 3 times the value of all of Germany itself. Germany's private central bank, to which Germany had gone deeply into debt to pay the costs of the war, broke free of governmental control, and massive inflation followed, mostly triggered by currency speculators, permanently trapping the German people in endless debt. When the Weimar Republic economically collapsed, it opened the door for the National Socialists to take power. Their first financial move was to issue their own state currency, which was not borrowed from private central banks. Freed from having to pay interest on the money in circulation, Germany blossomed and quickly began to rebuild its industry. The media called it the German miracle. Time magazine lionized Hitler for the amazing improvement in life for the German people and the explosion of German industry, and even named him Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1938. Once again, Germany's industrial output became a threat to Great Britain, resulting in these comments. Should Germany merchandise, do business, again in the next 50 years, we have led this war, World War I, in vain, Winston Churchill in the Times, 1919. We will force this war upon Hitler if he wants it or not, Winston Churchill, 1936 broadcast. Germany becomes too powerful. We have to crush it. Winston Churchill, November 1936, speaking to U.S. General Robert E. Wood. This war is an English war, and its goal is the destruction of Germany. Winston Churchill, autumn 1939 broadcast. Germany's state-issued value-based currency was also a direct threat to the wealth and power of the private central banks. And as early as 1933, they started to organize a global boycott against Germany to strangle this upstart ruler who thought he could break free of private central banks. As had been the case in World War I, Great Britain and other nations threatened by Germany's economic power looked for an excuse to go to war. And as public anger in Germany grew over the boycott, Hitler foolishly gave them that excuse. Years later, in a spirit of candor, the real reasons for that war were made clear. The war wasn't only about abolishing fascism, but to conquer sales markets. We could have, if we had intended to, prevented this war from breaking out without firing one shot, but we didn't want to. Winston Churchill to Truman. Fulton, USA, March 1946. Germany's unforgivable crime before World War II was its attempt to loosen its economy out of the world trade system and to build up an independent exchange system from which world finance couldn't profit anymore. We butchered the wrong pig. Winston Churchill, The Second World War, Bern, 1960. As a side note, we need to step back before World War II and recall Marine Major General Smedley Butler. In 1933, Wall Street bankers and financiers had bankrolled the successful coup by both Hitler and Mussolini. Brown Brothers Harriman in New York was financing Hitler right up to the day war was declared with Germany. And they decided that a fascist dictatorship in the United States, based on the one in Italy, would be far better for their business interests than Roosevelt's New Deal, which threatened massive wealth redistribution to recapitalize the working and middle class of America. So the Wall Street tycoons recruited General Butler to lead the overthrow of the U.S. government and install a Secretary of General Affairs who would be answerable to Wall Street and not to the people, and would crush social unrest and shut down all labor unions. General Butler pretended to go along with the scheme, but then exposed the plot to Congress. Congress, then as now in the pocket of the Wall Street bankers, refused to act. When Roosevelt learned of the planned coup, he demanded the arrest of the plotters, but the plotters simply reminded Roosevelt that if any one of them were sent to prison, their friends on Wall Street would deliberately collapse the still frail economy and blame Roosevelt for it. Roosevelt was thus unable to act until the start of World War II, at which time he prosecuted many of the plotters under the Trading with the Enemy Act. The congressional minutes into the coup were finally released in 1967 and became the inspiration for the movie 7 Days in May, but with the true financial villains erased from the script. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service as a member of our country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commissioned ranks from second lieutenant to major general. During that period, I spent more of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I suspected that I was just part of a racket at the time. Now I'm sure of it. Like all members of the military profession, I never had an original thought until I left the service. My mental faculties remained in suspended animation while I obeyed the orders of the higher-ups. This is typical with everyone in the military service. Thus, I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national city bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 through 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China, in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room would say, a swell racket. I was rewarded with honors, medals, and promotion. Looking back on it, I feel I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 city districts. I operated on 3 continents. General Smedley Butler, former U.S. Marine Corps Commandant, 1935. As president, John F. Kennedy understood the predatory nature of private central banking. He understood why Andrew Jackson fought so hard to end the second bank of the United States. So Kennedy wrote and signed Executive Order 11110, which ordered the U.S. Treasury to issue a new public currency, the United States note. Kennedy's United States notes were not borrowed from the Federal Reserve, but created by the U.S. government and backed by the silver stockpiles held by the U.S. government. It represented a return to the system of economics on which the United States had been founded, and this was perfectly legal for Kennedy to do. All told, some $4.5 billion went into public circulation, eroding interest payments to the Federal Reserve and loosening their control over the nation. 5 months later, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and the United States notes pulled from circulation and destroyed, except for samples held by collectors. John J. McCloy, president of the Chase Manhattan Bank and president of the World Bank, was named as part of the Warren Commission, presumably to make certain that the banking dimensions behind the assassination were concealed from the public. As we enter the 12th year of what future history will most certainly describe as World War III, we need to examine the financial dimensions behind the wars. Towards the end of World War II, when it became obvious that the Allies were going to win and dictate the post-war environment, the major world economic powers met at Bretton Woods, a luxury resort in New Hampshire, in July 1944, and hammered out the Bretton Woods Agreement for International Finance. The British pound lost its position as the global trade and reserve currency, and its place was taken by the U.S. dollar, part of the price demanded by Roosevelt in exchange for the U.S. entry into the war. Without the economic advantages of being the world's central currency, Britain was forced to nationalize the Bank of England in 1946. The Bretton Woods Agreement was ratified in 1945. And in addition to making the U.S. dollar the global reserve and trade currency, obliged the signatory nations to tie their currencies to the dollar. The nations which ratified Bretton Woods did so on two conditions. The first was that the Federal Reserve would refrain from overprinting the dollar as a means to loot real products and produce from other nations in exchange for ink and paper, basically an imperial tax. That assurance was backed up by the second, which was that the US dollar would always be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Of course, the Federal Reserve, being a private bank and not answerable to the US government, did start overprinting paper dollars, and much of the perceived prosperity of the 1950s and 1960s was the result of foreign nations' obligations to accept the paper notes as being worth gold at the rate of $35 an ounce. Then in 1970, France looked at the huge pile of paper notes sitting in their vaults, for which real French products like wine and cheese had been traded, and notified the United States government that they would exercise their option under Bretton Woods to return the paper notes for gold at the $35 per ounce exchange rate. Of course, the United States had nowhere near the gold to redeem the paper notes, and so on August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon, quote-unquote, temporarily suspended the gold convertibility of the U.S. Federal Reserve notes. This Nixon shock effectively ended Bretton Woods, and many global currencies started to disengage from the US dollar. Worse still, since the United States had collateralized their loans with the nation's gold reserves, it quickly became apparent that the US government did not in fact have enough gold to cover its outstanding debts. Foreign nations began to get nervous about their loans to the US, and understandably were reluctant to lend any additional money to the United States without some form of collateral. So Richard Nixon started the environmental movement with the EPA and its various programs such as quote-unquote wilderness zones, roadless areas, heritage rivers, wetlands, all of which took vast areas of public lands and made them off limits to the American people, who were technically the owners of these lands. But Nixon had little concern for the environment, for the real purpose of this land grab, under the guise of the environment, was to pledge those pristine lands and their vast mineral resources as collateral on the national debt. The plethora of different programs was simply to conceal the true scale of how much American land was being pledged to foreign lenders as collateral on the government's debts, eventually almost 25% of the nation itself. With open lands for collateral already in short supply, the U.S. government embarked on a new program to shore up sagging international demand for the dollar. The United States approached the world's oil-producing nations, mostly in the Middle East, and offered them a deal. In exchange for only selling their oil for dollars, the United States would guarantee the military safety of those oil-rich nations. The oil-rich nations would agree to spend and invest their U.S. paper dollars inside the United States, in particular in U.S. Treasury bonds, redeemable through future generations of U.S. taxpayers. The concept was labeled the petrodollar. In effect, the U.S., no longer able to back the dollar with gold, was now backing it with oil, other people's oil. And the necessity to control those oil nations in order to prop up the dollar has shaped America's foreign policy in the region ever since. But as America's manufacturing and agriculture has declined, the oil-producing nations faced a dilemma. Those piles of U.S. Federal Reserve notes were not able to purchase much from the United States because the United States had little other than real estate, which anyone wanted to buy. Europe's cars and aircraft were superior and less costly, while experiments with GMO food crops led to nations refusing to buy U.S. food exports. Israel's constant belligerence against its neighbors caused them to wonder if the U.S. could actually keep up their end of the petrodollar arrangement. Oil-producing nations started to talk of selling their oil for whatever currency the purchasers chose to use. Iraq, already hostile to the United States following Desert Storm, demanded the right to sell their oil for euros in 2000. and the United Nations agreed to allow it in 2002 under the Oil for Food program instituted following Desert Storm. 1 year later, the United States reinvaded Iraq, lynched Saddam Hussein, and placed Iraq's oil back on the world market only for US dollars. Following 9/11, the US policy shift away from being an impartial broker of peace in the Middle East to one of unquestioned support for Israel's aggressions only further eroded confidence in the petrodollar deal, and even more oil-producing nations started openly talking of oil trade for other global currencies. Over in Libya, Muammar Gaddafi had instituted a state-owned central bank and a value-based trade currency, the gold dinar. Gaddafi announced that Libya's oil was for sale, but only for the gold dinar. Other African nations, seeing the rise of the gold dinar and the euro, even as the US dollar continued its inflation-driven decline, flocked to the new Libyan currency for trade. This move had the potential to seriously undermine the global hegemony of the dollar. French President Nicolas Sarkozy reportedly went so far as to call Libya a threat to the financial security of the world. So the United States invaded Libya, brutally murdered Gaddafi, the object lesson of Saddam's lynching not being enough of a message apparently, imposed a private central bank, and returned Libya's oil output to dollars only. The gold that was to have been made into the gold dinars is, as of last report, unaccounted for. According to General Wesley Clark, the master plan for the dollarification of the world's oil nations included 7 targets: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. Venezuela, which dared to sell their oil to China for the yuan, is a late 8th addition. What is notable about the original 7 nations originally targeted by the US is that none of them are members of the Bank for International Settlements, the private central banker's private central bank located in Switzerland. This meant that these nations were deciding for themselves how to run their nation's economies, rather than submit to the private international banks. Now the bankers' gun sights are on Iran, which dares to have a government-controlled central bank and sell their oil for whatever currency they choose. The war agenda is, as always, to force Iran's oil to be sold only for dollars and to force them to accept a privately owned central bank. The German government just recently asked for the return of some of their gold bullion from the Bank of France and the New York Federal Reserve. France has said it will take 5 years to return Germany's gold. The United States has said they will need 8 years to return Germany's gold. This suggests strongly that the Bank of France and the New York Federal Reserve have used the deposited gold for other purposes, and they are scrambling to find new gold to cover the shortfall and prevent a gold run. So France suddenly invades Mali, ostensibly to combat Al-Qaeda, with the US joining it. Mali just happens to be one of the world's largest gold producers, with gold accounting for 80% of Mali exports. War for the bankers does not get more obvious than that. Americans have been raised by a public school system and media that constantly assures them that the reasons for all these wars and assassinations are many and varied. The US claims to bring democracy to the conquered lands. They haven't. The usual result of a US overthrow is the imposition of a dictatorship, such as the 1953 CIA overthrow of Iran's democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh and the imposition of the Shah, or the 1973 CIA overthrow of Chile's democratically elected government of President Salvador Allende and the imposition of Augusto Pinochet, or, to save a people from a cruel oppressor, revenge for 9/11, or that tired, worn-out catch-all excuse for invasion, weapons of mass destruction. Assassinations are always passed off as crazed lone nuts to obscure the real agenda. The real agenda is simple. It is enslavement of the people by the creation of a false sense of obligation. That obligation is false because the private central banking system, by design, always creates more debt than money from which to repay that debt. Private central banking is not science, it is a religion, a set of arbitrary rules created to benefit the priesthood, meaning the owners of the private central bank. The fraud persists, with often lethal results, because the people are tricked into believing that this is the way life is supposed to be, and no alternative exists or should be dreamed of. The same was true of two earlier systems of enslavement, rule by divine right and slavery, both of which are systems designed to trick people into obedience, and both of which are now recognized by modern civilization as illegitimate. Now we are entering a time in human history where we will recognize that rule by debt, or rule by private central bankers issuing the public currency as a loan at interest, is equally illegitimate. It only works as long as people allow themselves to believe that this is the way life is supposed to be. But understand this above all else: private central banks do not exist to serve the people, the community, or the nation. Private central banks exist to serve their owners, to make them rich beyond the dreams of Midas, and all for the cost of paper, ink, and the right bribe to the right official. Behind all these wars, all these assassinations, the 100 million horrible deaths from all the wars, lies a single policy of dictatorship. The private central bankers allow rulers to rule only on the condition that the people of a nation remain enslaved to the private central banks. Failing that, any ruler will be killed, and their nation invaded by those other nations which are already enslaved to private central banks. The so-called clash of civilizations we read about on the corporate media is really a war between banking systems, with the private central bankers forcing themselves onto the rest of the world, no matter how many millions must die for it. Indeed, the constant hate-mongering against Muslims lies in a simple fact. Like the ancient Christians, prior to the Knights Templars' private banking system, Muslims forbade usury, the lending of money at interest. And that is the reason why the American government and media insist that Muslims must be converted or killed. They refuse to submit to currencies issued at interest. They refuse to be debt slaves. So off to war American children must go to spill their blood for the gold of the money junkies. We barely survived the last 2 world wars. In the nuclear bioweapon age, are the private central bankers willing to risk incinerating the whole planet just to feed their greed? Apparently so. Flag waving and propaganda aside, all modern wars are wars by and for the private bankers, fought and bled for by third parties, unaware of the true reason why they are expected to be crippled and killed. The process is quite simple. As soon as the private central bank issues its currency as loan at interest, the public is forced deeper and deeper into debt. When the people are reluctant to borrow anymore, that is when the Keynesian economists demand the government borrow more to keep the pyramid scheme working. When both the people and government refuse to borrow anymore, that is when the wars start, to plunge everyone even deeper into debt to pay for the war, then after the war to borrow more to rebuild. When the war is over, the people have about the same as they did before the war, except the graveyards are far larger, and everyone is in debt to the private bankers for the next century. This is why Brown Brothers Harriman in New York funded the rise of Adolf Hitler. As long as private central banks are allowed to exist, inevitably, as night follows day, there will be poverty, hopelessness, and millions of deaths in endless world wars until the earth itself is sacrificed to Mammon in flames. The path to true peace on earth lies in the abolishment of all private central banking everywhere, and a return to the state-issued value-based currencies that allow nations and people to become prosperous. All right. Woo, that was a scorcher. I'm going to end this part 9 of this series here, but I want to add as an aside that, of course, this book was written some years before, and it's not acknowledging really, if you include the Cold War actually as World War III, we are actually in right now, present day, World War IV. We are in the Second American Revolution. We are in the largest war that has ever existed between light and dark in the heavenlies and on this planet. It is truly the end times, but not end times for the humans, not end times for we the people, but the end times for the corruption and the corrupt, dark cult beings that have been in control of this world for over 6,000 years. That is the position we are in. And that truth is what has lit a fire under me, along with my great love for humanity, for my country, for the well-being of all beings in all worlds. That is what has lit a fire under me to use my energy to produce this series and other clips on my channel. So I hope this was edifying. There will be more. There's part 10 coming up soon. And I thank you so much for liking this clip, for hitting the notification bell. Thank you for becoming a subscriber to my channel, and for sharing this. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. I'm going to end with the closing prayer, and what I'm saying in this prayer is God bless all beings in all worlds. Before I do that, I'm going to show you the cover of this book. Here it is. Meet Your Straw Man and Whatever You Want to Know. And you can purchase that on Amazon. Om, Om, Om. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace. I'm sending you all of my love and hugs, and God bless you and yours now and always. Thank you so much for watching this clip, and I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye for now.